When Nick received the call from his stepmother, Beth, he hadn't expected much more than a request to catch up. His father, busy as ever, rarely made time for family, leaving Beth to manage everything alone. Beth had been the picture of warmth when Nick first met her years ago, a vibrant woman who always had a smile and a calming presence. Over the years, they'd built a friendly connection, but after moving to another city for work, they hadn't seen each other in months. So when Beth suggested they meet up during his business trip, Nick was genuinely pleased. They arranged to meet at a quiet hotel near the city's outskirts, somewhere discreet where they could chat without interruptions. He arrived early, seated in the lobby, and noticed her the moment she walked in. She wore a soft lavender dress that flowed around her hair loosely framing her face, and he was taken aback by how little she had changed. There was something about her, an effortless grace, a warmth in her smile that reminded him why he'd always looked up to her. They hugged briefly, the familiarity of her presence calming the day's tension. Beth suggested they start with drinks, and they found a quiet corner in the hotel bar, sitting side by side on the cushioned bench. As they sipped their drinks, they spoke easily, catching up on missed time and filling the spaces with laughter and shared memories. Nick noticed small details he hadn't before: the way her fingers wrapped around the glass, the soft scent of her perfume, the gentle way she laughed, her hand sometimes resting on his arm, as if they were old friends sharing a secret. "You know," Beth began, leaning in a little closer, "it's nice to talk to someone who remembers the good parts. Your dad's wonderful, but he can be so focused on his work. It's as if I'm invisible sometimes." Nick felt a pang of sympathy, realizing how lonely it must be for her. He knew his father loved her, but he also knew his dad's dedication to work could be all-consuming. "Beth, he's lucky to have you," Nick said, his tone sincere. "You've always been there for him." "For me too." She smiled softly, her eyes brightening. "Thank you, Nick. You've always known just what to say." Her hand lingered on his for a second, her touch warm and familiar. She quickly pulled back, a hint of color rising in her cheeks. "It's strange, you know, feeling so at ease with you, like you've always understood me in a way no one else has." They continued their conversation, but the air between them had shifted. Nick noticed a new spark in her gaze, a trace of something unspoken lingering in the air. The longer they talked, the more he felt a connection he hadn't expected, a closeness that went beyond family ties. After their drinks, Beth glanced around and suggested they move somewhere quieter. "I got a room here just for the night," she said casually, her eyes avoiding his. "Why don't we go up and order some room service? It'll be more comfortable than sitting here all night." Nick hesitated but nodded, feeling an inexplicable pull to stay with her. They took the elevator up in silence, the quiet hum adding to the tension. In the soft glow of the room, Beth kicked off her shoes and relaxed, settling onto the couch, inviting him to sit beside her. She ordered wine and a light meal, and they chatted as if they had all the time in the world, the night stretching out with a calm ease that felt intimate, almost forbidden. As the evening wore on, they leaned in closer, their laughter fading to soft, shared smiles. Beth's hand brushed his arm, a small, lingering touch that sent a jolt through him. He looked at her, caught off guard by the depth in her gaze, the unspoken emotion that seemed to fill the space between them. "Nick," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm glad you're here. I've missed this. Missed you." Her hand lingered on his shoulder, her fingers tracing a light, trembling path down his arm. He was acutely aware of the warmth of her touch, the softness of her skin, and the unspoken understanding that had settled over them. He swallowed, struggling to process the intensity of his emotions. "Beth, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she replied, her voice a whisper. She looked at him, her expression vulnerable, her eyes searching his. "Sometimes it just feels right to be near someone who understands." He nodded, unable to pull away, even as he felt the tension building between them. Her hand moved to his, her fingers interlocking with his, in a gesture so simple yet so laden with meaning. He felt his pulse quicken, a mixture of anticipation and confusion swirling within him. He knew he should step back, that there were boundaries they shouldn't cross, but in that moment those boundaries seemed to fade, leaving only the undeniable connection between them. They sat in silence, holding hands, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The world outside felt distant and unimportant, replaced by the closeness they shared, the quiet understanding that seemed to bridge the gap between them. Beth's eyes lingered on him, her expression soft yet intense, as if she were seeing him for the first time. Without thinking, he leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. She closed her eyes, her hand tightening around his, and he felt the depth of her emotions, the silent plea for connection that neither of them dared to voice. As the night wore on, they talked in hushed tones, their conversation drifting into whispered confessions and quiet laughter. Beth shared memories he had never heard before, moments from her life that she had kept hidden, and he listened, entranced by her openness, her vulnerability. He felt a surge of protectiveness, an urge to be there for her in ways he hadn't considered before. Their hands remained intertwined, the contact both comforting and exhilarating, a reminder of the unspoken bond that had formed between them. He could feel the gentle pulse of her heartbeat through her fingers, a steady rhythm that mirrored his own, and he wondered if she felt the same spark, the same longing that filled him. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, they fell into silence once more. Beth rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes heavy with sleep, but she didn't pull away. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close, and they sat together in the quiet dawn, knowing that they had crossed a line they could never uncross. The sun rose slowly, casting a soft glow across the hotel room. Nick watched as Beth's breathing evened out, her face serene, her hand still entwined with his. He marveled at how, in this silent moment, everything felt natural, as though they had known each other this way all along. Yet, beneath that tranquility lay the simmering awareness that they were on the edge of something they couldn't take back. He held her a little tighter, savoring the warmth of her beside him, knowing that soon they'd have to face the world outside. Beth stirred, her lashes fluttering as she slowly came to. When she realized she was leaning against him, her cheeks colored, and she quickly sat up, adjusting her hair. "Oh, Nick," she whispered, her voice still heavy with sleep. "I didn't mean to fall asleep on you like that." "It's okay," he replied softly, unwilling to let go of the closeness they'd shared. "I didn't mind." For a brief moment they sat in silence, the weight of the night's intimacy lingering between them. Beth looked down at their still joined hands, her thumb tracing gentle circles over his skin. She hesitated, and he could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. Her gaze flickered toward the window, where the morning light painted soft shadows across the room, a reminder of the world waiting for them beyond these walls. "We should probably get going soon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But she made no move to pull away, her hand still clasped tightly in his. Nick took a deep breath, struggling to put his emotions into words. "Beth, I know this is complicated, I know it's wrong, but I can't ignore how I feel." He squeezed her hand gently, his heart pounding as he waited for her response. "Last night, it meant more to me than you might realize." Beth looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and sadness. "Nick, you don't understand," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I've tried to fight this. I've told myself it's just a passing feeling, that it's something I can control. But every time I'm around you—" She paused, her gaze dropping to their intertwined hands. "I feel something I can't explain." Their shared admission hung in the air, a fragile truth neither of them had expected to voice. Beth's fingers tightened around his, and he could see the conflict in her eyes, the part of her that wanted to run, to pull away, and the part of her that was drawn to him with a force neither could deny. In that moment, Nick felt a surge of courage, a need to reassure her, to let her know she wasn't alone in this confusion. "I feel it too, Beth," he whispered, his voice steady, despite the turmoil churning inside him. "And maybe it's not something we need to understand right now, maybe it's just something we feel." Beth's gaze met his, and he saw a glimmer of hope flicker across her face, tempered by the reality of their situation. She took a shaky breath, her fingers trembling in his grasp. "Nick, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm strong enough to face the consequences." He reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. We don't have to decide anything right now, he murmured, his voice gentle. All we have is this moment. Whatever happens after, we'll face it together. Beth closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, her hand covering his, as if to hold on to this fleeting moment. I wish it were that simple, she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet desperation. I wish I could just stay here with you, forget everything else. They stayed like that for a long moment, her head resting against his hand, their breaths mingling in the soft light of morning. Nick felt the world around him blur, leaving only the warmth of her touch, the soft rhythm of her breathing, the way her fingers clung to his, as though she too was afraid to let go. But as the minutes passed, reality began to creep back in. Beth pulled away slightly, her expression filled with regret and resolve. We can't stay here, Nick, she said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. No matter how much I want to, we can't pretend this is something it's not. Nick felt a pang of disappointment, but he knew she was right. Their lives were intertwined with others, responsibilities and expectations that couldn't be ignored. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving a part of himself behind, a part that had found something beautiful and rare in the quiet intimacy they'd shared. Beth rose, her movements graceful yet heavy, as though the weight of their shared secret was something she carried in every step. She looked back at him, her expression soft but guarded. Let's just keep this between us, okay? No one else needs to know. He nodded, his chest tight with the knowledge that this moment was slipping away. Of course, he replied, his voice barely audible. It'll stay between us. They left the hotel room in silence, their footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. The elevator ride down was filled with unspoken words, shared glances that held a lifetime of emotion. Nick felt the weight of the night pressing down on him, an ache that wouldn't easily fade. Outside, the city had already awakened, its sounds and colors bright and bustling, indifferent to the quiet storm raging within them. Beth hesitated, her hand lingering on his arm, her eyes filled with a depth of emotion that sent a jolt through him. Take care, Nick, she whispered, her voice steady, but her gaze betraying the turmoil beneath. You too, he replied, his heart aching with the words left unsaid. They parted ways, each walking in opposite directions, carrying the weight of their shared moment. As Nick moved through the crowded streets, he felt the distance between them grow, a physical reminder of the emotional wall they had built to protect themselves. But no matter how far he walked, he knew he couldn't leave behind the memory of her touch, the warmth of her gaze, the quiet vulnerability they had shared. Days passed, but the memory lingered, woven into the fabric of his thoughts, a constant undercurrent that colored his every moment. He found himself replaying their time together, the quiet conversations, the gentle touches, the way she had looked at him as though he were the only person who truly understood her. He knew it was something he could never forget, no matter how much he tried to move on. Then, one evening, just as he was settling into his apartment, his phone buzzed with a message from her. His heart leapt, and he hesitated before opening it, as though reading her words might somehow unravel the fragile control he had built around his feelings. Nick, the message began, her words carefully chosen, filled with a quiet yearning that was unmistakable. I just wanted you to know, that night meant more to me than I can say. I know it's wrong and I know we can't change what we are, but for what it's worth, I don't regret it. He stared at the message, his heart pounding, a flood of emotions surging through him. He wanted to reply, to tell her that he felt the same, that their connection had changed something fundamental within him. But as he typed out a response, he hesitated, knowing that whatever he said would never be enough to capture the depth of what he felt. Instead, he saved the message, leaving it unread as a reminder of a moment that would forever remain etched in his memory, a quiet, forbidden connection that had changed them both in ways they could never fully understand. As he put down his phone, he felt a strange sense of peace, a calm acceptance of the complexity of his feelings. He knew that their connection would always be a part of him, a beautiful and bittersweet reminder of the night they had shared. And though the world might never know, he held that memory close, a secret he would carry with him, forever unspoken yet always felt. The days following Beth's message were a blur for Nick. He threw himself into work, into distractions, into anything that would quiet the persistent hum of memories replaying in his mind. But no matter what he did, he couldn't escape the thought of her. Her gentle laugh, the warmth of her hand in his, the way she'd looked at him in that hotel room, as though he were the answer to a question she'd never dared to ask. Late one night, as he lay in bed, he found himself scrolling through their old messages. Most of them were casual, simple exchanges that spoke of a time when things were simpler, before they'd crossed a line. Yet now each word seemed laced with hidden meaning, each interaction a reminder of the closeness they had shared. Then, out of nowhere, his phone lit up with a new message from her. His heart raced as he opened it, half expecting her to say that she regretted everything, that they needed to stop whatever it was they'd begun. But her message was brief, almost cryptic. "Are you free tomorrow?" He hesitated, a dozen questions swirling in his mind. Was she reaching out because she missed him? Or was this her way of trying to clear the air, to settle whatever had been left unsaid? Despite his reservations, he couldn't resist the pull of her message. He replied, agreeing to meet her at a small cafe near her place, a spot they'd once visited years ago. The next day he arrived early, his nerves fraying as he waited. When Beth walked in, he felt a surge of emotions he couldn't quite name. She looked as composed as ever, but there was a flicker of something vulnerable in her gaze, a quiet unease that mirrored his own. They ordered coffee, exchanging pleasantries as if they were strangers meeting for the first time. But as they sat across from each other, the tension between them grew, a silent thread that pulled them closer with each passing second. Finally, Beth took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly around her cup. "Nick, I know things have been complicated," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to understand something." That night she paused, her gaze falling to the table. "It wasn't just a fleeting moment for me. It meant something I can't ignore." Her words hung in the air, and Nick felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. He'd spent so many nights wondering if she regretted their connection, if she saw it as a mistake. But here she was, acknowledging the depth of what they'd shared, the bond that had somehow defied reason and convention. "Beth," he replied softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I feel the same way. I don't know how or why, but I can't forget what happened. I can't pretend that it didn't change something for me." She looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and longing. "I know it's wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but I can't help the way I feel. I've tried to fight it, to convince myself that it's just a phase, but..." Nick's grip tightened on her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a soothing gesture. "I don't think this is something we can just ignore," he said, his voice steady. "But I also don't know how to move forward. All I know is that I don't want to lose you." They sat in silence for a moment, each grappling with the weight of their unspoken feelings. Beth's hand lingered in his, a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty, and Nick felt a surge of protectiveness, a need to shield her from the world's judgment, to hold on to the fragile connection they'd found. Finally, Beth took a deep breath, her gaze steady. Maybe we don't need to have all the answers right now," she said softly. "Maybe we can just take things one step at a time, see where this goes, without forcing it into a box it doesn't fit." Nick nodded, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't expected. "I think I'd like that," he replied, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "No pressure, no expectations, just us." They finished their coffee in companionable silence, their hands still linked beneath the table. When it was time to leave, Beth glanced around nervously, as if afraid of who might see them. But Nick gently squeezed her hand, a silent promise that he would stand by her, no matter the cost. They walked side by side down the quiet street, the cool evening air a soothing balm against the tension that had lingered all day. As they reached her car, Beth hesitated, her eyes lingering on him in a way that made his heart ache with longing. "Nick, thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For understanding. For being here." He leaned in, his hand brushing her cheek in a gesture so intimate it made her eyes flutter closed. "I'll always be here, Beth," he murmured, his voice filled with conviction, "no matter what." She looked up at him, her gaze intense, and in that moment he felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. She leaned in, her lips brushing his in a kiss that was soft, tentative, yet filled with a depth of emotion that spoke of everything they couldn't say aloud. They pulled back, breathing heavily, their foreheads resting together as they clung to the fleeting connection they'd found. "I don't know what the future holds, Nick," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But for now, this is enough." As they parted ways, Nick felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He knew their journey was far from over, that the road ahead would be filled with uncertainty and doubt, but for the first time he felt a quiet confidence that they could face it together, one step at a time. In the days that followed, they maintained their unspoken agreement, exchanging messages and stolen moments, each interaction a reminder of the bond that had drawn them together. They didn't push for answers, didn't demand explanations, but simply allowed themselves to be, to exist in a space that was uniquely theirs. And though they knew the world would never understand, they found comfort in the quiet intimacy they shared, the knowledge that, in each other, they had found something rare and precious. It was a love that defied convention, a connection that went beyond words, a bond that would forever remain etched in the depths of their hearts. In the end, they didn't need the world's approval or understanding. All they needed was the quiet certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by a love that was as deep as it was forbidden, as beautiful as it was bittersweet.